The issue of Western separatism is one that comes up in Canada every couple of years, generally speaking, when the Liberals get re-elected. There's a long standing tradition of alienation in Western Canada, which dates back to the National Energy Program, among various other things, which was an attempt to increase the federal government's share of oil revenues from Alberta and Saskatchewan, as well as trying to redistribute it through price controls throughout Canada. It left a very sour taste in people's mouths, and it made people really angry in Western Canada. The other thing is just a lot of people in Western Canada feel like their votes don't matter. Quebec and Ontario are just so big. It just doesn't, to a large extent, matter how well the Conservatives do. Even if they get every seat in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it doesn't guarantee them even a minority government, let alone a majority government. For those of you who aren't really aware of how Canada's demographics work, Ontario is about 38% of the population, and Quebec is about 23. If you add in the various East Coast provinces, which often vote Liberal, you get to a point where it's two-thirds majority of the country is outside of Western Canada. Actually, almost exactly, I just added it up, and it's 31.5% of the country's population is in Western Canada. So people feel alienated. They feel that minor changes in Quebec and Ontario are what determine federal elections. It doesn't really make much of a difference who they vote for. Their interests will just not be represented. Federal parties just have to pander to Ontario and Quebec, and they always get the short end of the stick. There's also a lot of questions of international trade. Alberta and Saskatchewan really want to sell their energy more to like the US, to China on the international stage. There's constant blocking of pipeline expansion, other energy exploitation. And there's just a lot of frustration in feeling that Western Canada is kind of an economic colony of central Canada, if you want to use that term for Quebec and Ontario. And it's just they don't feel like they're getting anything out of the Federation anymore, that they're too culturally, economically, and financially, fiscally divergent at this point in time. And they just kind of want to go their own way, either to join the United States or as a fully independent state. And so I wanted to do a video just looking at what this would actually look like. What's the actual political situation on the ground in Western Canada? What are some potential Western Canadian separatist states? Like, what would they look like? And what are kind of some options for them if they were to become independent? So that being said, let's just get right into it. So firstly, we're going to start off by taking a look at the federal election results. Now, the 2025 ones are not available yet, or I would have used those. But I'd imagine they would be somewhat similar. The PPC did quite well in 2021. So I decided to combine them with the Conservative Party just because it gives a better idea of what the point I'm trying to get across. So in Western Canada, the Conservatives and PPP, or what's in Canadian terms considered right of center, got over half of the vote. In the rest of Canada, they got just over a third of the vote. So that's a pretty big difference. There's almost a 20% vote difference in terms of how well right of center parties do in Western Canada versus the rest of it. And if you start going into other provinces, it gets even more stark. The Conservatives got a two-thirds majority, got two-thirds of the vote in Saskatchewan, half in Manitoba, close to two-thirds in Alberta, a sizable plurality in British Columbia. So it's definitely a lot more, they're a lot stronger in that part of the country. The other aspect I think people sometimes overlook is the votes that don't go to the Conservatives don't go to the Liberals largely. In Western Canada, at least compared to the rest of the country. So the New Democrats get about a quarter of the vote in Western Canada, but only 15 to 16% in the rest of the country. So once again, that's a very big difference. Once we take a look at provincial politics, it's even more so. But yeah, like if you look at it, the NDP do quite well in Western Canada. In a number of provinces, I think in all of them except for Manitoba, they do better than the Liberal Party. I mean, the NDP comes from Western Canada, at least in the form of the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was the precursor. And generally speaking, in Western Canada, people tend to either vote NDP or conservative. And this is often true in rural areas. And you saw a lot of NDP seats in the 2025 election switch to conservative. Because the Liberals, this is kind of my narrative, the Liberals are the party of like cosmopolitanism, big urban centers, strong federal government. And they just don't really have much to offer like working class people or rural people or farmers or even to a certain extent the cities in Western Canada. They just generally don't offer as much. BC is a bit more like Eastern Canada, so it tends to vote that way. But I think this gives you an idea of the political divide. Once again, most of the PPC vote went to conservatives in the 2025 election. So I'd imagine this is probably pretty close, but we don't have final numbers yet. So let's take a look at provincial elections, and this also gives you a good idea of it. So we just have right of center party because in most of Canada, you will have well, not in most of Canada, but traditionally in Canada, you'll have a conservative party, a liberal party, and the New Democrats. If you're in Quebec, it's very different, but we aren't going to get into Quebec in this video. In Western Canada, it's very different than Eastern Canada. The Liberal Party at a provincial level has more or less ceased to exist in most provinces. The closest it comes to existing is Manitoba, where it sometimes will get one seat in provincial elections. So in British Columbia, you had the Liberal Party of British Columbia, which was not associated with the Liberal Party federally, which was initially a merger of the Conservative Party of British Columbia and the Liberal Party of British Columbia, given how strong the NDP was, and it governed the province for quite a few years. Then it changed its name to BC United, and then it ceased to exist, and now we have a Conservative Party again. The point being that there is really no Liberal Party in BC at a provincial level. You have kind of people split their vote federally in British Columbia. Some people who vote Conservative or BC United will vote Conservative federally, and some will vote Liberal federally. They just largely don't exist because, once again, they didn't really have that much to offer the people of British Columbia. In Alberta, the Liberal Party just doesn't really exist anymore either. It gets significantly less than 1% of the vote. There's been talks about changing its name. For a while in Alberta, you had the Progressive Conservative Party, and then you had the Wild Rose Party, which was kind of more populist. So you had the two main parties were theoretically right of center. But in recent years, the Progressive Conservative Party collapsed. It merged with Wild Rose. Now we have the United Conservative Party, and the NDP has become the primary opposition there, and they've actually won an election or two. In Saskatchewan, you had the Liberal Party merged with the Conservative Party to found the Saskatchewan Party, and they've been very dominant there since that time period. And in Manitoba, once again, you have no Liberal Party of any significance. You have the Progressive Conservatives and the NDP, and there's really nothing else. For those of you who are confused, the conservative parties in Canada from like the 20s to the 90s tended to be called the Progressive Conservative Party because part of the Progressive Party merged with the Conservative Party. So at the provincial level in most of Canada, they're still called Progressive Conservatives. I'm not going to go through the whole breakdown of the Conservative Party at the federal level. It's called the Conservative Party of Canada today, but up until the 90s, the main Conservative Party in Canada was the Progressive Conservatives. Okay, so what could a potential Western state look like? What are the possibilities for the different borders? So the most straightforward ones, and the ones that I think have the most public support, would be either Alberta becomes independent or Alberta and Saskatchewan become independent. These two provinces are also very conservative. There's a lot of oil and gas in them, and just other resources in general. There's a lot of agriculture, minerals, like I said, oil and gas. There's a lot of cattle come from there. Like if you buy beef in a Canadian store, it's normally from Alberta. They're both fairly wealthy provinces. Saskatchewan used to be really poor, but now it's fairly well off. And they both feel very alienated, and they're both fairly similar politically. So I think either this or this is the most likely. Now, there's the question of Manitoba. Manitoba, just because of its position, is somewhat divided between Western Canada and Ontario. One of the problems it has is Manitoba is just a poor province, and poor provinces in Canada tend to be more supportive of the Liberals and strong federal government because they kind of exist off of the gibs that they get from the federal government. So Manitoba is fairly dependent upon that. And it's kind of up in the air whether or not it would pick to go one way or the other. And when we look at vote shares, you can see that is more divided than in some of the other parts of the country. So then we have the just the west coast, just the west. So this would be BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And then there's the complete west, which would be all of these. Now, I've seen different maps. Some include the Yukon and Northwest Territories, some don't. But I think the thing to keep in mind here is Alberta and Alberta, Saskatchewan are both landlocked. So if those two were to declare independence, they would border the US and the rest of Canada, and that's it. They'd have no access to the sea. They'd basically kind of be locked in, and they'd be dependent on either going through the US or going through Canada in order to gain any kind of access to the ocean. So that would kind of prevent them from achieving like the sort of full sovereignty and becoming a fully independent state, at least in my opinion. If Manitoba was to join, Manitoba is theoretically not a landlocked province. It does have a port up here on Hudson's Bay. The Arctic is not particularly a nice place to ship from. I guess they could develop it, but practically speaking, it's better, but they're still kind of landlocked. If BC joins, that's when things start to get interesting. I actually just think from a geographical standpoint, either BC, Saskatchewan, and Alberta kind of make sense as an independent state, or all the Western provinces, because then you would have a significant amount of territory. You would have a lot of access to the ocean. You'd have some more industrial areas and some more resource producing areas. The problem, though, is that BC is problematic in terms of joining. Now, the most recent surveys I could find had Alberta at about 30% support for separatism, which is actually way higher than I thought it was. Saskatchewan at 33 and BC at 27. So not a majority or even a plurality, but that's quite high. That does indicate that there's a pretty big level of dissatisfaction with the federal government. Now, in contrast, the closest that Quebec ever came in a referendum that was probably rigged was roughly 50-50. It was slightly more in favor of staying with Canada, which I suspect that there was some fortifying of that election. But just something to keep in mind that Quebec, for all its talk of independence, is only at about 50%. So 33 is getting up there. So that is if we are just going to go with administrative borders as they currently exist. We could also go with political borders. That is based on the population, and this would solve the issue of southwestern BC being a Liberal stronghold, a Liberal and NDP stronghold. The area around Vancouver and Victoria is just very left-wing, and it's very different than the rest of the province. I mean, I think this shows it quite well. A lot of the interior is dark blue. Thinking of America for a minute. And the only parts that are not blue are the cities, but even then, the cities have moved rightward quite a bit. So this is what a MP from, I think, BC posted. So it would be Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the blue parts of BC. I keep screwing up and almost saying the red parts of BC because I'm used to talking about American politics. America, I think, is there's very few countries in the world where red is right wing and blue is left wing. I just cover American politics so much it kind of gets mixed up in my head. And this kind of conforms to these borders. Now, Yukon, I think, sometimes votes conservative. It sometimes votes liberal. Just keep in mind these are a little misleading because like the top 70% of Manitoba is one electoral district because nobody lives there. So it looks huge, but that's just one seat, and that's just one seat there. And then the territories are one seat each. So keep in mind, like the actual population of these areas is largely irrelevant. That's true for some of the rural areas, but yeah, it on paper it looks a lot smaller than it actually is. So what would a new state look like? Because I'm not sure people really know what the population figures are like for Western Canada. Like what would be these different potential states? So if Alberta was just to declare independence, it would have about 5 million people, which is not a lot. I think that's about the population of Norway, Ireland, New Zealand, Slovakia, Finland. So I guess about like a mid to small European state. So once again, like not terrible or anything, but not huge. Saskatchewan really doesn't have many people in it. It only has like 1.1 million. So you could add that on and that would bring it up to 6 million. So that's a little bit better, but not great. It would be bigger than I guess, Finland or Costa Rica. But once again, not a very large country. This is, I think, the most probable one, which is Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, because that would give access to the Pacific Ocean. And I kind of feel like a lot of states, particularly this one, would need some way to import and export goods overseas. So countries with about that many people would include Sweden, Portugal, Greece, Hungary, Azerbaijan, Bolivia. So we're getting more into a mid-sized country at that point in time. We're kind of moving from the small EU state to kind of like the mid-sized EU states. So that I think is more of a reasonable population to have a independent country with. And then I just also have BC, Alberta here just for the heck of it. If you were to have all four, it would be 13 million. Not many people live in Manitoba, so that would not add that much, and it would not add that much to GDP. It would be massive in terms of land area if you just start to look at the numbers. But the GDP, I think, is would be fairly reasonable. Let me just check what some similar amounts would be. So Alberta, Saskatchewan in Canadian dollars would have an economy about the size of. It is very hard when you're dealing with GDP numbers, but about the size of Portugal or Finland or Greece or Algeria or Kazakhstan. So somewhere in that area. Once again, it's very hard because you're dealing with PPP versus nominal and somewhat close. If you were to take the whole thing together, though, and combine all of Western Canada, you would have a GDP similar to Sweden or Belgium or Ireland or Israel or something like that. Once again, this is in Canadian dollars, and the ones I'm looking at are in USD, so take that with a grain of salt. But it would have like the GDP of a country that is able to function with its size. It would go from being like a tiny country to being a small-ish country. Because a lot of the countries we mentioned are big enough to kind of be sovereign. Also, the GDP per capita, I believe, would actually be quite decent. Once again, this is Canadian dollars, so I'm just kind of eyeballing this a bit. This would be about the same as like Finland or the UK or France or Austria. So it would have a developed country's GDP per capita. So economically and population-wise and land area-wise, At least a combination of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, I think, is possible as an independent state. Alberta, Saskatchewan would have to either have some sort of agreement with the U.S. or Canada. Like if you were gonna say what are the most likely ones, I'd say the most likely independence would be ABSK, this one, or I guess all four in that order. Okay, so let's bring up the concept just to throw a complete sideball to the concept of free association. This is something that the United States has, and there's similar examples to this throughout the world. Generally speaking, this is something that comes up with colonies that don't want to be independent or are too weak to be independent on their own. So they have some sort of agreement with their former colonizer country. It's what we used to call kind of a protectorate. Like within the Roman Empire, you would have client kingdoms, which would be within the Roman Empire and would pay tribute, but were autonomous on like a domestic level. And in a lot of cases, this would happen in different places, like in British India. Maybe this isn't the best example. A lot of the princely states were vassals of the British Empire, but they had a lot of internal autonomy. Like they're technically independent states, but they have a certain relationship with a stronger state. So let's just kind of go through this a bit. So this is something the U.S. developed because it had all these extra territories it took during the Spanish-American War, and they're too valuable to completely let go because they're in strategic positions, or they just don't want someone else to grab them, but they don't want to integrate them because they're poor, distant, and integrating them would require them to take full responsibility for them and develop them and extend constitutional protections and social security and all that other stuff, which they don't want to do. So they have something called a Compact of Free Association. So it's not a territory or a state, but a self-governing country that has UN membership and can conduct some of its own foreign affairs, but most of its foreign affairs and its defense are handled by another country. So there's a guarantee of independence. Unlike territories, the citizens don't have the people there don't have U.S. citizenship, but because they're free associated states, it's often a lot easier for them to just go to the U.S. They're kind of viewed as part of America, like as I don't know, like a bigger country or part of America in a geopolitical sense, but on like a local sense, no. It's kind of complicated, but hopefully you kind of get what I'm describing here. So the U.S. does provide them with financial aid. A lot of these are very dependent upon financial aid from the U.S., but they're not full citizens, so they don't get the same level that like Puerto Rico would get. And so this is often like a mutually beneficial arrangement, wherein they don't have to assume full responsibility for a country. But for instance, if any of these countries were to discover resources in the economic exclusion zone, they found a bunch of oil, the U.S. would probably have the first crack at it. And they would be able to exploit the resources from there. They can also use it as military bases, and there's other uses for it. I think if Greenland was ever to actually become American, this is probably what would happen, is it would become a free associated state with the U.S. because it's too small really to annex outright. It's too like ethnically homogenous and culturally homogenous. And having to take full responsibility for Greenland would be a nightmare. So I think that's the most likely outcome. So let's look at this chart. So this is what would happen, the possibilities of what would happen if Western Canada seceded. So we have, I think, the three main ones. So we have full independence. That is, they become a full sovereign state. They call themselves Western Canada, or I don't know, Greater Alberta, or something like that. I don't know what the name would be, but they become a fully independent sovereign state like Thailand or Indonesia or Costa Rica or Bolivia or just like a normal country on the world stage. They could enter into a pact of free association with the US, or they could just join the US as states, either as states or as integrated territories. So, under this, what would this look like? Okay, so full independence, I think we know. Free association with the US, they would be autonomous, but the US would handle their defense and a lot of their foreign policy, which I think they would kind of need it because they would have to basically form a army from scratch. Whatever, I guess, Canadian federal infrastructure is there, they'd inherit, but they'd have to build their own army and their own institutions, and they could kind of lean into some of the American ones. Now, if they were to join the U.S. outright, then they don't have to worry about any of that. The U.S. government would just provide it. There's a lot of economic issues with becoming its own independent country. They'd have to sign their own trade agreements. They need their own currency, stuff like that. If they were to be free associated with the U.S., they could probably just use the U.S. dollar as their currency, or a currency pegged to the U.S. dollar. And they could probably rely on the U.S. to negotiate trade deals from them, or they would just use whatever the U.S. ones were. And it's not really, I don't think we really have to go into detail if they were part of America. So yeah, they would have to immediately negotiate a trade deal with the U.S. and Canada. If they were free associated, they'd probably just get direct access immediately. Becoming part of the U.S., though, would be very attractive because they'd get federal funding. Companies might move there. Then again, companies might move out of there to other parts of the U.S. And then we just go through some other stuff. Like, I don't know how much they thought about this. Federally provided pensions and healthcare would vanish overnight. And once again, they'd have to figure out income taxes. They'd have to figure out pension funds. They'd have to come up with all of this stuff. They have to come up with their own public services. I mean, they'd have the provincial ones, but they'd have to come up with some stuff for the whatever the new federal or confederal government of the Western Canada is, or it would just be a confederation and it'd be very loose. You might even have like them join free associate with the U.S. on an individual basis. I'm not really sure how it would work. There's also the issue of like laws and customs and cultural identity and all that kind of stuff. And their relationship with the U.S. would depend on that. I suppose they could also become free associated with Canada, but I feel like that's not really interesting to talk about at the moment. But yeah, this is kind of where we are at the moment. We have full independence, which I think would probably be a mess, at least for a couple of years, maybe a decade until they get things going. I don't think full independence is possible without at least some of BC joining, because it would leave it landlocked. You have kind of a compromised position, acknowledging that its geographic position and military strength means it can't be fully independent, but it gets the autonomy that it longed hoped for from the federal government. Or they can just roll the dice and join America and inherit all the benefits and drawbacks that come along with that. So what are the odds of this actually happening? I'd say low. I don't know if the federal government would even let them leave, if there would be a referendum. Quebec, in my opinion, did vote to leave, but the federal government said they would not respect the referendum. And I think it was rigged so that they would lose by a very small margin and the issue would just kind of go away. So I don't know if the federal government would, in that case, deploy military forces or what would wind up happening. I don't think they would ever accept it because in the modern world, unless your government is right wing or whatever, parts of your country aren't allowed to declare independence. I just think the whole thing is completely impossible if BC doesn't join. Unless they have access to the Pacific Ocean, it's just, I don't think, going to go anywhere. I do think, though, that 30% is actually quite high, especially if those people are politically engaged. Keep in mind, only about like 64 to 69% of the population actually vote. In federal elections, I don't know what it is in provincial, but that's a lot of people who are really, really dissatisfied. And keep in mind, in Quebec, it's like 50%. I don't know what it is these days, but it was 50% when you had the referendum. So it's getting up there. What I think is going to happen, though, for the immediate future is you're just going to have political turmoil between the center of Canada and the West. There'll be legal battles galore over pipelines. Some of the Western provinces will just stop enforcing federal government mandates. They'll withhold funding. You'll just have constant showdowns. There's going to be more political fragmentation. And I think the thing that we might see is the parties kind of become more regionalized. I don't know if this means that the Conservative Party will split and part of it will run under a different banner in Western Canada, and then maybe in Eastern Canada, it'll have a separate one. If the Liberals will just completely stop caring and pretending that they care about Western Canada and just become more of a regional party, I'm not really sure. I think it's likely, though, that increasingly within some of these parties, particularly the Conservatives and Liberals, they'll become increasingly dominated by their base of from the country, and they'll start to kind of abandon the pretense of serving any kind of collective national interest. So those are my thoughts on the matter. I hope people found that interesting. I hope that gave people kind of some idea of what an independent Western Canada might look like. Personally, I think if they wanted to become independent, the best deal by far would be to seek free association with the U.S., because that would basically give them everything they wanted, autonomy, sovereignty, but they wouldn't have to deal with a lot of the major headaches of being an independent country. Like they could adopt U.S. currency, U.S. trade deals. They could have the U.S. protect them. And they could still preserve their cultural identity. I think that would probably be the best bet. I don't entirely see the purpose of declaring independence from Canada just to join the U.S. I kind of feel at this point in the game, America is more politically centralized than Canada was, than Canada is. I feel like Canada's become a lot more decentralized over time, and America has centralized a lot of power in the federal government. So like I said, I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and lots more exciting content to come.